nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Natha Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsava Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shashwat Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payura Shomura Kelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdnani Patyakshito. Namah Shri Krishna Chandraya Nirupadi Kripakrite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Premarasam Tanvan Kalo Tadrisha Bhavam Bhavam Yo Pratayitum Na Yobataram Ayataha Adurjana Sharanam Sajayati Chaitanya Vigraha Krishna Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adananastrinam Dantair Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Shri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdhanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Vrajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Nirupadi Madhukari Yatu Pada Padme Bhaktir Ya Nikilarta Varga Janani Ya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Yena Bhukti Muktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bhajayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Yakarya Brajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namaha Yaramya Nikilaga Sangha Shamani Shrotratitim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mahita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we absorb ourselves in Padyavali, and specifically the 5th verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam. So in our last discussion, we've come to this final verse of the Dainyokti Prakaran, and we've read through the introduction to the verse. So today, we'll again hear the meaning of the verse, and then we'll look at the philosophical, if you will, framework or the philosophical context in which we can understand how this verse is expressed. Specifically, we're taking this up from the perspective or the point of departure given by Kaviraj Goswami Pad, that Sriman Mahaprabhu has expressed this verse adopting the mentality of a jiva, and thus praying, so to speak, to Krishna on behalf of the jiva, so as to describe both the existential condition of the jiva in samsara, as well as what is an appropriate jiva to Krishna from the midst of such an existential condition. So today we'll review many points which, for those who follow the classes on the Chaitanya Charitamrita, we've covered to some extent in the course of the Sanatana Shiksha, certain passages in Madhya Lila 20 as well as 22, which describe this subject. We'll cover again some of the material from the Sandarbhas, as well as the work of Sanatana Gosvami Pad and Sri Chakravarti Pad that are relevant to understanding how the jiva is beginninglessly bound in samsara, and thus why there is the necessity of this prayer and what is the intended sense of this idea of one being, quote, fallen in material existence. So that's where we'll dive in today. So I'll start with the verse and then we'll look at the relevant passages. Ayi nanda-tanūja kiṅkaraṁ patitaṁ viṣame bhavāmbudhau kṛpayā tava pāda-paṅkaja sthita-dhūlī-sadṛśaṁ vicintaya. Ayi, O son of Nanda, please graciously consider me, your servant who has fallen into the untraversable ocean of material existence, to be like a speck of dust fixed at your lotus feet. So, Sri Kaviraj Goswami Pad summarizes the import of this prayer as follows. Forgetting you, I, your eternal servant, have fallen into the ocean of material existence, being bound by Maya. Please graciously make me like a speck of dust at your lotus feet. Please engage your servant in your service. So, from the way gerunds work in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, there are different ways that you could interpret it, the relationship between the gerunds and the finite verb, and in what order they come is also flexible and to be interpreted according to context. So, from a minute philosophical analysis, it can be difficult exclusively based on these payars to arrive at a crisp philosophical understanding of what is being said. So we'll attempt to tease out what is Kaviraj Goswami's intention by reference to the work of the earlier Goswamis. By speaking from the perspective of a jiva bound in samsara, and of himself as a servant of Sri Krishna, Sriman Mahaprabhu in this verse teaches that the essential nature of the jiva is that of an eternal servant of Krishna. His delineation of this to Sri Sanatana Gosvami Pad is also recounted in Chaitanya Charitamrita. Quote, the jiva's essential nature is that of being an eternal servant of Krishna, Krishna's intermediary potency, tatastha Shakti, and a manifestation both different and non-different from Krishna, like a particle ray of the sun or a spark from fire. This teaching that the jiva's essential nature is that of a servant of Sri Krishna can be found in Padma Puran, as is shown by Sri Jiva Goswami Pad in his exposition of the jiva's essential nature in Paramatma Sandarbha, where he quotes the following verse. Quote, the jiva, the knower of the field, ever dependent and a servant of Hari alone and never of anyone else, is referred to by the letter M, or Ma, in Om. So this whole section that he quotes from is an elaboration of the meaning of Om given in the Padma Puran, where the other letters of the Omkar are said to represent Krishna and his Shakti, and then specifically the Ma is said to represent the Jiva. So, giving that point here, he refers to it. But his principal purpose in citing the passage is not to elaborate on Om, but to elaborate on the nature of the jiva. So the main point here is this idea that he's ever dependent, or she, or it, or whatever pronoun you prefer for the jiva, is a servant of Krishna and ever dependent upon Krishna. So these are the points that Jiva Goswami and other Goswamis elaborate on. The ontological basis of the jiva's being ever dependent, or this paratva, upon Sri Bhagavan, and being a servant, or dasatva, of Sri Bhagavan, is the jiva's ontological status of eternally being a part of Bhagavan. So what we're going to do here is look at the various statements that are made about the nature of the jiva, and then see a philosophical hierarchy, or a philosophical stack, if you will, to how they come to be understood. In other words, it can appear like this is said about the jiva and that is said about the jiva, and these different properties can be stated, but it may not always be clear that there's an internal relationship between these properties, and one thing is said because of the other, which is said because of another, which is said because of another. And when we see that inner relationship of the properties, we get a much clearer picture of how the constitution or the essential nature of the jiva is quote-unquote constructed, or how its beginningless form is structured. So, one of the key passages in this regard is in the Shruti Stuti, which Jiva Goswami cites as follows. The Shrutis address Sri Bhagavan. They, the Vedas, say that the embodied being without external or internal coverings, that is, the jiva whose essential nature is not covered by anything except adjuncts manifest by Maya, in these abodes, that is, bodies of your own making, is an eternally established part of you, who are the bearer of all potencies. And Sanatana Pad, in this regard, says the following. One should understand oneself as, quote, being his own, or to belong to him, on account of the self's being a part of him, or angshatva. One should thus understand, quote, because of my being a part of him, I am dependent on him and an eternal servant of him. So here we get the first step, if you will, in the logic. How do we get to this conclusion that the jiva is a servant of Bhagavan by its constitution? And how is it that the jiva by its constitution is dependent on Bhagavan? So that notion of service and dependence is based on being a part of Bhagavan, who is the whole of which the jiva is a part. So as a part belongs to a whole, so the jiva belongs to Bhagavan. So Sanatana Pad is saying that this role that the jiva has as a servant is based on its being a part of a greater whole and having a part to play or a contribution to make to that whole. So because it's a part, it's dependent and it's a servant. It should also be understood more specifically that the jiva is not just a part or angsha of Bhagavan in general, but specifically a, quote, differentiated part, or vibhinangsha, of Bhagavan Sri Krishna's Paramatma aspect. The nature of a differentiated part is defined in a passage from the Varaha Puran, cited by Sri Jivapad in Krishna Sandarbha, as a part that is possessed of only minor potency and capability in comparison to the whole angshi to which it belongs. So, if you have a rock, you break it in a few parts, then those rocks, those parts of the bigger rock, they all have all the same characteristics as the rest of the rock. So if you say the jiva is a part of Bhagavan or a part of Parabrahman, then does it mean of equal stature and equal nature in all respects, the way one bit of a rock is the same as the other bits of rock that it was a part of? No. Therefore, it's not just a part in general or an unclassified sense, but a specified type of part, what's known as a vibhinangsha, or a differentiated part, or a part that has characteristics that are different from the whole that it's a part of. You extract a little bit of water from a cup of water, that little part that you took out has all the same properties as the water that it was removed from. So, not like that. In other words, the jiva is not simply just one part of a substance that's otherwise homogeneous, but rather it has, here it says, minute potency and capability in comparison to the whole. So it's a part, but it's not in any way equal to the whole or necessarily equal to other parts of the whole, meaning other shaktis of the whole, as we'll see. So, moreover, the basis of the jiva's being a part of this whole, namely Paramatma, is the jiva's being a shakti that belongs to Paramatma. So, the presupposed question here is, okay, this is a part of a whole, so is it like a drop of a bigger body of water? Is it like a rock from a bigger boulder? How is it that it's a part? So he's saying, not in that literal sense, it's a part just in the sense that it's a shakti. So how is that? This is explained. Quote, having made known that the jiva is a part only of you who are qualified by the jiva shakti, that is of Paramatma, and not rather of the pure one, that is, of the Paratattva who is free from such qualification, meaning of the Bhagavan aspect of the Paratattva. In other words, the aspect of Bhagavan that's purely dealing with transcendence and nothing of the Mayak realm or even the intermediary realm. Realm meaning nature. The Shrutis indicate that the jiva's being a part of Paramatma is specifically because of the jiva's being a form, or alternately of the nature of his Shakti. The oneness with the Paratattva, which is known from the statement in Chandogya Upanishad, you are that, tattvam asi, of the Jivatma, who is not possessed of extreme non-distinctness from the Paratattva, is that of being of the same constitution or form, saman akarata, on account of the Jivatma's being an entity, the form of which is consciousness, that is an existent part of him, that is, of the Paratattva. Meaning, the oneness of the jiva with the Paratattva is on account of the jiva being a part of the Paratattva that is conscious in constitution just like the Paratattva is. As someone can find, beginning from birth, within a cavern in a house, who wishes to know the sun, after having been shown a particle ray of the sun that has somehow fallen through an air hole into the cavern, is instructed by someone, quote, this is that, meaning, this light you see here is the sun, meaning, because of this, that is, this sun ray that you have seen, having the same constitution of light as the sun, on account of its being a part of that, a vast orb of that light is to be conceived. That is, you are to acquire an understanding of what is the sun, of what the sun is, by imagining a vast orb made up of a huge number of the rays of light you see here. So, that is, in a manner akin to the aforementioned method of instruction, is the jiva similarly being a part of him on account of the jiva's being existent as a particular shakti of his. So this point is from the Tattva Sandarbha. So he's saying that the jiva is a shakti of Bhagavan. And why is the jiva regarded as a shakti? Because it's of conscious nature, like Bhagavan, or it shares the same basic constitution of being constituted of consciousness. So it's a part of Bhagavan, and it has oneness with Bhagavan as a shakti, and as a shakti constituted of consciousness. So then the question can come, okay, the jiva is a das, and the jiva is dependent because it's a part. And it's a part because it's a shakti. Specifically, this intermediary shakti of Bhagavan, because the jiva is not just a part in general, but a differentiated part, or a distinct part, a vibhinangsha. So then the question can come, well, how do we understand that the jiva is a shakti? Or what kind of shakti? So progressing deeper ontologically, The basis of the jiva's being a Shakti of Paramatma is the jiva's ontological intermediacy, or tatastatva. So Jiva Goswami elaborates on this as follows. The jiva's being a form, or alternately of the nature of Shakti, furthermore, is understood because of its being constituted of the tatastha Shakti, and because of its being eternally a dweller in him, namely Paramatma, even while being comparable to a light ray of his, that is, even while being comparable to something that exists outside of him. So although the jiva has recognized to be separate from Bhagavan, it's composed of the same fundamental substance of consciousness, like Bhagavan, or like Paramatma, and it's said to be a dweller in him, or a dependent upon him, the way a light ray does exist outside the sun, and yet is dependent upon Bhagavan, or dependent upon the sun, for its existence. So he elaborates further. This intermediacy, furthermore, is because of the jiva's non-entrance or non-inclusion in either category. That is, because of the jiva's being included neither in the category of the Parashakti nor in the category of the Maya Shakti. Because of the jiva's being beyond or superior to the Maya Shakti, by virtue of the jiva's being constituted of consciousness and the Maya Shaktis being constituted of matter, and two, because of Paramatma's having no taint as a result of the fault in the form of the jiva's degradation and so forth by ignorance. That is, the jiva is understood to be a third Shakti of Paramatma, distinct from both the Parashakti and Maya Shakti, because the jiva is superior in constitution to the Maya Shakti by virtue of being a conscious entity, yet also dissimilar from the Parashakti, which is also a conscious entity, because the jiva is subject to the influence of the Maya Shakti, that is, ignorance, whereas the Parashakti is not subject to the influence of Maya, and furthermore, is the means by which Paramatma himself remains forever uninfluenced by the Maya Shakti. So, simply speaking, because the characteristics of the jiva are not entirely one with the Parashakti or entirely one with Paramatma, it can't be included or equated directly with the Shakti that constitutes Paramatma. So it has some distinction from that, but because it's certainly also not equivalent to the Maya Shakti, it needs to be given its own category, or it needs to be recognized as a distinct entity. So thus it is intermediary, or because it shares it shares properties with one, but it also shares the ability of being influenced by the other. So it shares in proximity in the sense of potential for influence with the other, then it's regarded as intermediate. So it doesn't fit into either category. It lies on the margin, so to speak, between them, conceptually speaking. So it's regarded as intermediary, or tatastha. In his commentary on the aforementioned verse from Srimad Bhagavatam about the essential nature of the jiva, Sri Chakravartipad elaborates on the implications of the jiva's intermediacy, with reference to a definition of the jiva given in Narada Pancharatra, which Sri Jivapad also discusses in the aforementioned section of Paramatma Sandarbha. So, Chakravartipad gives an interesting and very useful explanation of the definition of a jiva from the Narada Pancharatra. So he says, this characteristic, that is, the jiva's characteristic of being constituted of the tatastha Shakti of Paramatma, is also described in Narada Pancharatra. Quote, that which is intermediary, conscious in nature, issued forth from that which can be known only by itself, that is, issued forth from its basis, namely Sri Bhagavan's Paramatma aspect, who can be known only when he makes himself known, and colored by attachment to qualities, gunas, is called the jiva. The meaning of this verse is as follows. That which is intermediary and a conscious existent, to be known specifically, that is, to be known as an individual part of Bhagavan's Paramatma aspect, is called the jiva. So we've got a conscious entity, of an intermediary nature, that's the jiva. As per the Shruti, or the Brihadaranyaka specifically, as sparks emanate in various directions from a fire, so exactly all the pranas, all the planes, all the devas, and all living entities emanate in various directions from the self, namely Paramatma. When the jiva is beginninglessly issued forth from, quote, that which can be known only by itself, sva-samvedyat, meaning from the midst of the mass of consciousness known as Bhagavan, then it shall become, quote, colored, or ranjita, by attachment to qualities, gunaragina. That is, it shall become colored in the sense of being possessed of a mayic form through attachment to Maya's own qualities by means of the external Maya Shakti. This is the meaning. Now here Chakravarti Pad very cleverly gives an alternate meaning, which wouldn't be expected or isn't found elsewhere, but is a very useful contribution to support Jiva Goswami's whole coining of this tatastha concept, drawing from this Pancharatra statement and other statements in the Vishnu Puran. Quote, when, on the contrary, the jiva shall become delivered from Maya by pure predominant bhakti, it shall become colored in the sense of devoted to Bhagavan and possessed of a form constituted of consciousness through attachment to the Chit Shakti's own auspicious qualities by means of the internal Chit Shakti. So in that way, whichever other Shakti the jiva is influenced by, the jiva becomes attached to and enmeshed in that, be it the higher Shakti or be it the lower Shakti, the internal or the external Chit or Maya. So in that way, it's intermediary. In this way, furthermore, the name intermediate or tatastha is given to the jiva because of being situated on the median or tata between the Maya and Chit Shaktis. So there isn't any literal median where all jivas are lined up, but that when you analyze the jiva's constitution, because it has this liminal nature, which shares the potential to be influenced by either one, and shares some aspect of similarity with the higher Shakti, but yet dissimilarity from the higher Shakti as well because of its susceptibility to the influence of the lower Shakti, it's out of the higher category, but not in the lower category. Therefore, it's, quote, in the median or marginal in constitution. In summary, the jiva's intermediacy is the basis of its being a Shakti of Sri Bhagavan. The jiva's being a Shakti of Sri Bhagavan is the basis of its being an Angsha of Bhagavan. And the jiva's being an Angsha of Bhagavan is the basis of its being a servant of Bhagavan. So this is the philosophical progression, if you will. And I didn't want to go into excessive detail here, but if you wanted to add some steps, then you can look further in Jiva Goswami's work and see that this tatasthatva, or this intermediacy, boils ultimately back down to the achintya beda beda siddhanta, and how tatasthatva, or, tatasthatva is based on shaktita, and shaktita is based on this idea that all visible objects are, quote, achintya jnana gochara, or they are perceived or recognized to have some capability which we can't fully conceive of the nature of, because it can't be completely considered to belong only to the object or to be completely separated from the object. So it has something that we can't fully comprehend how it has it. So therefore it's, quote, achintya, or inconceivable. There's a lot more further elaboration on this in the Sarva Sangvadani and elsewhere. But in gist, the whole theory boils down ultimately back to that basis of achintya beda beda, which paves the way for the idea of Bhagavan and Shakti, or Shakti and Shaktiman being a different and non-different, or beta and abeda aspects of one entity. And then from that fundamental beda beda of Shakti and Shaktiman, you get these Shaktis, you get the intermediacy of these Shaktis, and therefore you get the jiva being a part, and therefore a das. This is, you could say, all the steps in the process, but I didn't want to go too much into that much detail in this context, because in Padyavali we're not focused on that side of things so much, but at least in this case I wanted to do a little bit of that side of things, just to give that foundation for appreciation of this verse of the Shikshastakam. And because it's a topic which has had some, discussion, and it relates to certain debates about the nature of the jiva and so forth, I thought it would be helpful to give some of the statements of the acaryas in this regard in a way that pulls things from multiple places together in a way that shows the progression of thought clearly, I hope. So, all of these features of the jiva's essential nature exist inherently in the jiva beginninglessly and endlessly, irrespective of whether the jiva is in a state of bondage within samsara or a state of freedom from samsara. So this is a very important point, that none of these things that is being said are simply because of the jiva's enmeshment in samsara, or simply because of Maya's influence. This is where the Advaitavad wants to come and say that the jiva is angsha, or the jiva is this or that, only due to the influence of Maya. No, here it's clear that the whole concept of the jiva being a shakti, the jiva being an angsha, the jiva being a das, the jiva being tatastha, all of these things are not dependent on the jiva being subject to Maya in any way. They're relevant to the ontological nature of the jiva, whether the jiva is under the influence of Maya or not. So this is a very important feature of the Gaudiya viewpoint. Moreover, the jiva's intermediacy is the basis of how it is an entity that is ontologically a servant of Bhagavan, can exist either in the state of being intentionally and actively engaged in service to Sri Bhagavan, imbued with bhakti by the Parashakti, or in a state of being oblivious or even averse to Sri Bhagavan and utterly devoid of bhakti to him by the influence of the Maya Shakti. So when the jiva is, quote, said to be a servant of Bhagavan, that doesn't in any way imply that the jiva has bhakti inherently in it. This is a way of describing the jiva's ontological nature. It doesn't have anything to do with bhakti. It has to do with exactly what we've said, that the fact that the jiva is an angsha, the jiva is a shakti, the jiva is a tatastha shakti, which shares the property of what? Consciousness. It doesn't say shares the property of being possessed with the ladini vritti and bhakti and all of that. The aspect that it shares with the paratattva is simply that of samanakaranata, or this oneness in form of being constituted of consciousness. So the idea that the jiva is, by its essential nature, a servant of Bhagavan doesn't in any way imply that it has bhakti, or that anything the jiva does is bhakti. Rather, whether the jiva does have bhakti and is in the influence of the Parashakti and engaged in lila, or is in the realm of samsara and completely bewildered by Maya, the jiva is a, quote, das of Bhagavan, no more and no less in either case. Philosophically speaking, in a qualitative sense, certainly it's fulfilled its potential as a das by being imbued with the Parashakti and engaging in bhakti. That's what Jiva Goswami calls most swabhavika, or most natural to the constitution of the jiva, meaning since the jiva constitutionally is a das, and since bhakti is most complementary to something that is a das, thus bhakti is most complementary to the jiva's nature, or it's most befitting the jiva's nature, since servitude is expressed in its most beautiful or its most profound and endearing ways when it's performed with bhakti. In that sense, it's natural to servitude, if you will, and servitude happens to ontologically be the nature of the jiva. But it's not that, therefore, bhakti is the nature of the jiva. It's complementary to the nature of the jiva, and thus, quote, natural to the jiva. So, we can read a little more about that. Jiva Goswami summarizes the varying conditions in which all jivas exist at the conclusion of his discussion of the jiva's essential nature in Paramatma Sandarbha. Quote, thus, in this way, there are indeed innumerable intermediary potencies known as jivas. In that regard, there are two classes of them. One class is intent upon Bhagavan, verily beginninglessly, whereas the other is oblivious of Bhagavan, verily beginninglessly, because of the presence of awareness and the absence of awareness of him in their respective beginninglessly acquired dispositions. In that regard, the first class is favored by an expression of the internal potency and has the forms of eternal companions of Bhagavan, such as Garuda. The other, on the contrary, is the samsari, overpowered by Maya on account of the beginninglessly acquired fault of the defect of obliviousness of him, as is stated in the 11th canto, in this famous verse, Bhayam Dvitiya Bhiniveshata Syat, quote, non-awareness, misapprehension, and fear, because of absorption in a second, shall occur by means of Isha's Maya, for one who is averse to him. Therefore, a wise person, being one for whom the Guru is the Devata, that is regarded as a manifestation of the supreme object of worship, namely Bhagavan, and the self, that is regarded as most dear, should fully worship him, namely Bhagavan, with one-pointed bhakti. So Jiva Gosvami quotes this verse many times in many places, and some of the key points he makes on it are as follows. According to the principle stated in this verse, as long as one has obliviousness of me, she spreads ignorance over the jiva, produces absorption in the gunas, preceded by a covering of the true self, and thus binds the jiva. In the case of intentness upon me, on the contrary, she manifests the essential nature of the jiva, preceded by a removal of absorption in the gunas, and liberates the jiva. This is to be understood. So, this point is very important. Why? Because it explains that the obliviousness of Bhagavan is not caused by Maya, but that Maya acts on the jiva because of the obliviousness. Right? As long as one has obliviousness of me, she spreads ignorance over the jiva. So the jiva's constitution doesn't have any awareness of Bhagavan in it. The jiva has the potential to be conscious, but without a sukshma sharir, or a subtle body, a psyche made up of a mind and a buddhi and a ahankar and a chitta. There's no capacity for actual cognition. So there isn't the potential to actually, know or not know anything directly, so to speak. So if the jiva is existent and never favored by this higher Shakti, there's no awareness or there's obliviousness of Bhagavan for that jiva. And in that case, Maya exerts her influence over such a jiva. So that absence of awareness is part of the jiva's essential constitution. So it's beginningless, just like the jiva is. Yet, as it was just explained, some jivas beginninglessly are favored by this revelation or this dispensation of awareness of Bhagavan, and such that beginninglessly they've never been influenced by Maya and have always been absorbed in bhakti to Bhagavan. But for jivas who are not favored in that way, by their constitution they don't have awareness of Bhagavan, and in that condition Maya has the responsibility to exert her influence over them, such that they remain unaware of Bhagavan. So it's not that absence or that fundamental non-awareness of Bhagavan is caused by Maya, but in response to it, so to speak, even though it's beginningless, Maya is acting and spreading ignorance. And what does it mean by spreading ignorance? We'll get into further detail about that a little later. So that ignorance that she spreads is not specifically ignorance of Bhagavan. That was already there. That's the point that's special about this particular point that he makes. He doesn't say that in other places. But more importantly, the root of the jiva's deficiency is thus only the beginningless absence of awareness of the supreme entity, as is stated by the phrase for one who is averse to Isha. So in this verse that's under discussion, the agent or the main person who's being described is one who lacks awareness. And then everything else is happening by the instrumental or by the Maya who's described in the instrumental case. But that condition of being averse to Bhagavan, that's not under the influence of Maya. All these other things are coming about for that person by the influence of Maya. So this point that Jiva Gosvami made is actually derivable from the grammar of this statement in the Bhagavatam itself. And this point, more broadly, however, is very significant. So the root problem or the root deficiency is just that the jiva doesn't have this awareness and was never blessed to get it. That's the whole, basis of how all this chain of events, so to speak, beginninglessly flows. So he elaborates on that in the next passage. Quote, although Maya knows that her act of bewildering the jivas does not please Bhagavan, still being unable to tolerate the jiva's obliviousness constituted of beginningless ignorance of Bhagavan, as per the direction indicated in that verse, fear because of absorption in a second shall occur for one who is averse to Isha. She covers the jiva's essential nature and brings about the jiva's absorption in that which is not the jiva's essential nature. So the quote, ignorance that Maya inflicts is suppression of the jiva's awareness of self, suppression of, and directing of the jiva's awareness away from self, and we'll get into further discussion of that later. But here it's saying that she can't tolerate this beginningless ignorance of Bhagavan. So it's not that she put that beginningless ignorance into the jiva, that's already there, and in response to that, she's acting and suppressing the jiva's self-awareness, misdirecting the jiva's attention or capacity for awareness away from self. This is the further layer of ignorance, if you will, that's coming about by Maya's agency. Then, for one who is averse to Isha, meaning for one who is oblivious of Isha, non-awareness, that is, a non-manifestation of the essential nature of the self, occurs because of Maya. So now this is where the actual verse from the Bhagavatam is being glossed. These other three statements are showing the backlog, if you will, that Jiva Goswami can extract from this way that the verse is stated, that the subject in the verse is someone who's already averse to Bhagavan, and now that person who's averse or unaware of Bhagavan is being influenced by Maya, and now these other things are coming about by Maya's influence. So then he goes through the verse. This is actually Samipad's commentary, but Jiva Goswami cites it in full, so we can say that this part Jiva Goswami is accepting and in sync with with Sridhar Samipad. So he takes it like this, that for that person who has no awareness of Bhagavan, then what comes about? For one who is oblivious of Isha, non-awareness, that is, non-awareness of the self, occurs because of Maya. Then misapprehension, that is, I am the body, so there's a suppression of who you actually are. Then there's a misperception of who you are. So the actual thing is blocked, and then a wrong thing is put in the place of the thing that was right. And then fear because of absorption in a second. That is, in that false second self that's not actually the self. Once you're attached and believing that you're this vulnerable entity in the plane of death subject to constant uncertainty, then you experience fear, meaning more broadly anxiety, distress, suffering, etc. Since such an occurrence of fear as a result of absorption in something unreal, as a result of a misperception of the object, the true nature of which one is unaware of, is well known to occur even in worldly illusions, that is, conventional magic. So this is quite a nice comment of Samipad. In other words, how does a magician scare you? Right? He makes a cat jump out of a hat or something, or and surprise you, because he gives you the impression that this is just a hat. It's not a hat with a cat. So there's an actual object, and the real nature of that object is then shielded from your vision by some means, and then he causes it to appear as something that it's not. This is what you call sleight of hand, right? And then when suddenly it acts in a way that's not what you thought it was, then you experience shock or fear. So had you known all along that there was actually a cat in the box, you would have never got scared and you would have never been surprised. But because you didn't know, then, you felt this, fear as a result of having misperceived that object when you didn't know that you misperceived it because you thought you were perceiving it accurately. So the real trick is to make you confident in a false understanding. Once I've got you believing that you're right when you're actually wrong, now I can really mess with you. So this is a nice analogy to show how Maya, or illusion, works, so to speak. So, Sanatana Pad, in the Bhagavatam written now, he summarizes this process also in an insightful way. Quote, the transmigration, that is the state of being a samsari, the delusion, the form of which is that. So in other words, to be a samsari is simply to be deluded. He's just equating that. Being a samsari is to be deluded. These two things are the same thing. And how does that come about? That shall occur because of oblivion, that is non-inquiry on the part of the jivas in regard to their existence. That is, in regard to their own essential nature, existent as a part of Parabrahman, because of beginningless ignorance by means of the Maya of Krishna, that is, Bhagavan. So when you think and find confirmation for your misunderstanding that you're right, then you never question the misunderstanding, and therefore you never come to find out what the actual case is. Even in that state of being a samsari, because of beginningless ignorance, even that state of being a samsari, because of beginningless ignorance, is entirely delusional, because of the impossibility as a result of deliberation of even there being samsaris. So a jiva, in other words, a pure conscious entity, is never merely, a transmigrating entity bound in this world. That's never the full or the actual nature of the self. So he's saying, as a result of deliberation, in other words, if one actually inquires and deliberates on the nature of things, one will realize that that isn't who one is. But since one doesn't do that deliberation, one thinks that that's what one is. So this state that one is in is actually delusional, or it's not the actual state, but it's felt to be the state because there isn't sufficient deliberation done upon it. Sri Sanatana Pad's point here is that when a jiva deliberates on the nature and condition of the self in samsara, it is understood that the experience of being a samsari is ultimately just a beginningsly existent delusion, and that the jiva is not by nature a samsari, but rather only bound in a delusional state of identifying oneself as a samsari. This is shown in Srimad Bhagavatam, after Parikshit Maharaj inquires from Shukadeva Goswami, quote, is the jiva's relationship with the body causeless or possessed of a cause? And this is Chakravarti Pad elaborating slightly on the verse and giving the gist of the verse that's said in response to this. Quote, he states the answer in regard to this question. A relationship of the jiva with material objects, that is, the body, senses, and so forth, does not actually occur without maya, that is, the potency of beginningless ignorance, of the self, that is, Hari, just as a relationship of the seer of a dream with a dream body does not occur without ignorance. Since such a relationship of that which is constituted of consciousness, meaning awareness, and distinct from the body and so forth, occurs only by means of maya, meaning the inconceivable potency adept at causing that which is otherwise impossible. This is the meaning. In other words, this conscious entity can't actually be enmeshed in all these material things because it's so subtle, matter can't actually hold it or control it. It's like you can't actually, physically move space by swinging a brick wall. space is too subtle to be moved by anything gross. So all these material forces can't actually bind or directly connect with the jiva. But there's this glue or this agency that's producing this attachment or this entanglement of the jiva within these currents of material energy, and that's called maya. So it wouldn't actually be possible were it not for that function of maya making it possible. This is the point that Chakravarti Pad is being made. So is there a relationship with the body? The cause of the relationship between the jiva and the body is maya. With the aforesaid points in mind, the intent of Kaviraj Goswami's summary of the first half of the verse under discussion is to be discerned. Okay, so all this philosophical discussion having been made, now when we read the statement that's given in the Charitamrita, we have references from more, you could say, precise philosophical discussion to understand what this Bengali payar, which is the way it's grammatically constructed, is open to different interpretations, what would actually be the intended sense. So the statement itself reads, "Forgetting you, I, your eternal servant, have fallen into the ocean of material existence, being bound by Maya." The intended sense is that the jiva is ontologically, by virtue of its essential nature, an eternal servant of Bhagavan. The jiva's, quote, forgetting Bhagavan, meaning the jiva's absence of awareness of Bhagavan, and, quote, fall, that is, state of being enmeshed in the ocean of material existence, that is, samsara, are both beginningless and made possible by Maya. So, did the jiva fall down because of some original sin, or because it was jealous of Krishna, or, because it just made a mistake, or whatever? No. Actually, this whole idea of forgetfulness and this whole idea of falling are typically widely misunderstood and are actually somewhat can appear like misleading language, when through all this philosophical analysis we understand that both of these things are referring to beginninglessly existent states. It's not that forgetting implies that there was previously remembrance, or that falling implies that there was previously existence at a higher position. You might say, well, that's what forgetting and falling means, otherwise what do they mean? And you're right, in a literal sense, that those words do imply that if you forgot something, you knew it beforehand, and that if you fell, you were above the place that you are now. That is what those words mean conventionally. So from all this philosophical analysis, we come to the understanding that these words are not meant to be taken in their literal sense in this context. And that this quote, forgetting actually refers to a beginningless absence of awareness. This state of, quote, falling actually refers to a beginningless state of bondage. This means that the jiva bound in samsara has simply existed as such eternally without beginning and without cause. There's no beginning and no cause to the jiva being in samsara. It never was fully aware of Krishna and then forgot about him. It was never with Krishna and then fell away from Krishna. It simply, beginninglessly, eternally, without cause, was existing in this way. And Maya did not force that upon the jiva. Maya made that possible beginninglessly, such that effectively it's as though it's always been the case, and yet we describe Maya in some contexts, quote, as a cause, or here, quote, being bound by Maya, not because Maya came and, at one point in time tied a rope around your neck and tugged you over here, knocked you senseless such that you didn't remember. Not literally like that, although that language could be thought to suggest those ideas. So this means that the jiva bound in samsara has simply existed as such eternally without beginning and without cause. Sri Kaviraj Goswami recounts Sriman Mahaprabhu's teaching of this conclusion to Sanatana Pad elsewhere in the Charitamrita. Forgetting Krishna, the jiva is beginninglessly oblivious of Krishna. Therefore, Maya subjects it to the sufferings of samsara. Those vibhinangsha jivas are of two types. One type is those who are eternally, that is beginninglessly liberated, and one type is those who are eternally, that is beginninglessly in samsara. The eternally liberated are eternally intent upon Krishna's feet. They are known as his companions, and they experience the bliss of service to him. The eternally bound are eternally oblivious of Krishna. They are eternal samsaris and experience the suffering of Naraka, and so on. Because of that deficiency, the Pishachi Maya punishes them. She withers and torments them with the three miseries, those related to the self, and so forth. So, I'll stop here soon. Let me just, one more paragraph. So as per these and the aforementioned citations, it is to be understood that there is neither any cause of the jiva's, quote, forgetting Krishna and, quote, falling into samsara, nor is there any actual forgetting or falling on the jiva's part. That's right. The jiva did not fall and did not forget, even though it says that the jiva forgot and the jiva fell. So then you might say, well, then why do we use that kind of language if that's not literally the case? Rather, a jiva in samsara is simply beginninglessly devoid of awareness of Bhagavan because of no direct influence of Bhagavan's para-shakti over such a jiva ever having given that awareness to such a jiva. And in the absence of any such influence of Bhagavan's para-shakti, his maya-shakti has beginninglessly enmeshed the jiva in samsara. So, the mention of, quote, forgetting or falling in their non-literal sense, however, is not without significant import. So if you tell me, okay, this isn't meant to be taken literally, then someone can still object, well, why use this language in the first place then? Why not just use more philosophical language from the get-go? Why use this more colorful or figurative language when it's liable to being taken literally and thus leading to an erroneous conclusion? So, the purpose of using such language is as follows. These words are used for the sake of implying that they're opposites, namely, awareness of Krishna and dwelling in Krishna's personal company and abode are supremely desirable for every jiva, and the means by which every jiva's ultimate potential as an ontological servant can be realized. So, this language is chosen to cast these things in a negative light. In other words, to say that being oblivious of Krishna is not desirable. So it's as if you have forgotten something that's tremendously valuable to remember. And it's not ideal to be in this condition of samsara. It's ideal to be in Bhagavan's lila, to be embodied and engaged in things that are profoundly pleasing to him. So you're as though fallen from the potential that you could otherwise realize. So these types of words, they are useful. They have poetic value, and they have that suggestive sense that there is a state of awareness and there is a place of existence that are far better for you to be. And that's why this type of language is chosen and used in this poetic description by Mahaprabhu or here in the Charitamrita and elsewhere. But it's not that we should derive from this poetic language erroneous philosophical conclusions. Rather, we have to, deal with the matter philosophically where it's analyzed in depth, and then read poetic language through the lens of that philosophical understanding. And then we can appreciate the thrust and the force of the language, and still have a clear idea about what's ultimately being described. So that's my purpose in presenting all these citations. It may be review for people who were part of the classes on the Charitamrita where we already went through almost all these passages, but I felt that in the case of Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam here, where he talks about falling into the ocean of material existence, and the Payar in the Charitamrita also refers to this idea of forgetting Krishna, that it would be useful here to review and summarize the viewpoint of the earlier commentators on this subject, Jiva Gosvami, Sri Darsami, and also Chakravarti Pad, to keep it clear for those who wish to follow the siddhanta given by those acaryas. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any kind, please feel free. Yes?
Also, there are two groups, right? You mentioned Nityabhadra and Gesida.
Yes.
So my question is there a reference in these two groups? Where's the placement of sadhaka?
Of a sadhaka?
Yes. Which group does he belong?
Would come in the second group.
The question may be... Sorry?
Would come in the second group. I mean, someone who's a siddha will, not be a sadhaka.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, you're breaking up, so I can understand. So, where's the placement of sadhaka in these two groups?
In the second group.
As a potential, it's because every sadhaka succeeds, if that's the case?
Yeah. I mean, a sadhaka is one who has not achieved the goal, who's seeking to accomplish the end.
Yes.
So they won't be categorized among those who are completed. They'll be categorized among those who don't have the goal, but they'll be, in a better position than the general lot.
Okay, but not does we assume that every sadhaka succeeds and joins the second group? Or can we say sometimes sadhaka doesn't succeed and goes back to first group?
Okay, from what I understood, the first group was the nitya siddhas, right?
Yeah. Well, I was referring to the nitya pada as the first.
Oh.
So basically, let's say we have two groups, right? So sadhaka is could be varieties of person. There may be someone who succeeds, someone who doesn't succeed, but they still sadhaka at the moment. So my question is, what's the placement, actual placement? Is it possible to place sadhaka in between these two categories, or inside these two categories, or?
Yeah, sadhaka will be nitya baddha. Why not?
Why not? But is there any explanation on that? Because it seems to be obvious, but I'm just questioning how to hear it, like from in a pramanic conclusive statements.
But what would be? Why would there be any question about it?
Well, if indication sadhaka doesn't succeed, that's the thing.
I mean, they're beginninglessly bound. They've yet to achieve liberation, so they're still bound. So how would they still not be in the same group?
They may stop doing sadhana. They may, they realize, oh, it's not for me.
Right. So whether they do sadhana or not, they're still bound. They're still in the bound group, right?
Yes.
Right.
So it's case by case. It seems like it's not that every sadhaka is automatically siddha.
Wait, okay, I don't know, maybe I'm misunderstanding. Like, no sadhaka is a siddha. Sadhaka and siddha are two categorically opposite things, right? And there's nitya siddhas and nitya baddhas. So sadhakas cannot be nitya siddhas, so they're nitya baddhas.
Okay. Oh, this is what I mean by second group. Okay.
So they're among the nitya baddhas. There are those who are seeking siddhi rather than those who are baddha and happy with that. So they're a privileged section of the nitya baddha group, but still nitya baddha until they achieve siddhi.
Yeah, this is clear. But can we theologically accept that this potentiality of sadhaka is siddha?
Sorry, what shali?
Can we assume that every sadhaka is potential siddha?
Can we assume that every sadhaka is a potential siddha?
Yes.
Sure, why not?
In every case.
I mean, we don't believe in, like they have in the Madhva Sampradaya and the Ballabh Sampradaya, that certain jivas will just eternally remain bound and can never achieve siddhi. That's not part of Gaudiya theology. It's the potential is there for any jiva.
Okay. Is then like besides the known verses, is there a Rupa Gosvami Sanatana explaining that?
I mean, they never make any differentiation among the ontological nature of jivas the way other sampradayas do. So I think they never spoke to that specifically because they designed the system as a, quote, universal system for every entity.
Okay.
Maharaj?
Yeah?
So today we read that the root problem of the jiva is the lack of awareness, and the text said that we have an innate beginningless ignorance of Bhagavan and a beginningless enmeshment in samsara. However, it said upon a reflection, we should not identify as a samsari.
Yes.
So it seems a bit of a contradiction. You tell me I'm eternally enmeshed, not eternally, beginninglessly enmeshed in samsara, but I'm not a samsari. So this is just the process that we should increase our awareness that I am not a samsari. I'm actually eternal servant of Krishna, and I should aim towards that. Is that right?
Yes. And that's why Sanatana Gosvami described it as a delusion. In other words, even though it's beginninglessly existent, this is like a philosophical trick, if you will, to say something that's always there, but yet it's not part of your constitution either. In other words, you're bound in this, but it's not that you have to be. Or, it's not that that's all that you can be. It's just all that you've ever been.
Right.
So by having faith in the agency of Bhagavan, the agency of bhakti, then one can ultimately experience something else.
It's interesting that we should not cultivate identity as a samsari, but we should start to lean in the other direction. So it's just an interesting concept.
Yeah, it's one of the passages that I quoted of Sanatana Gosvami. It's part of actually his commentary on the section of Hari Bhakti Vilas about Buddha Shuddhi, which is the part of the process where all the elements used in puja are purified before being utilized in the worship. And then there's different rituals to purify, the bell and all this. But this Buddha Shuddhi part is the part to purify the self. So the self is purified by this meditation. The articulation of it in the Hari Bhakti Vilas in the commentary, he says, Nitya Sid, what is it? Kevalam Bhagavadiyoyam iti Kevalam Bhagavadiyoyam Shri Bhagavat Angshosmi Nitya Mukta Buddha Shuddha. Sorry, it's not coming to my mind. But anyway, the meaning of it is he says that I am an Angsha of Bhagavan, I am eternal, I am conscious, I am pure, I am a servant of Bhagavan, I am a seeker of his grace, I am dependent upon him. He lays down these points as how to purify the self by evoking or meditating on the nature that one is ontologically. So that's considered instrumental to having the right frame of mind, or being in a pure state, so to speak, to render service to Bhagavan. I'm sorry, I'm not recalling it off the mind. I I use this every day in my worship. So
I know what you're talking. Yeah, no, I know what you're talking about. So that's very helpful. I'll look at that. Thank you.
Sure, great. I see. Did you have another point, or is the hand up from before, Vidyasundarji?
It's from before. but good to mention, because this topic is a little bit, my question was provoked by the fact that upon this objectively listening this presentation, which is nothing new to me, but and then reflecting upon that, and it's quite depressing when you look at a picture of our existence, that, no rhyme, no reason. We're here just to suffer. And somebody tried to do, to understand, stretch this idea of suffering, is that why do you think that God is, his leelas are limited to one particular type? He may also, the suffering of jivas is also part of his leela, in order to play with them, bring them, call them back, or establish them in the first group, the liberated group. It could be, would it be the correct Siddhantic statements to say that this is actually happening, that Krishna is just doing this because of his unlimited, he's just unlimitedly variegated in his type of enjoying everything, including suffering of jiva, that he chose here, and for having them to think about and joining his actual happy lila in eternity. Would it be proper conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, just we just want to be careful not to paint him to be like a masochist. I mean, it's not that he's like literally taking pleasure in people's suffering as such. I mean, I don't think that's what you meant, but we don't want to imply literally that. But broadly speaking, yes, the Bhagavatam depicts the emanation, or what's called srishti, as a lila of Bhagavan, and as an expression of Bhagavan's own exhalation and inhalation, and his own, nature. So, broadly speaking, yes, we can say that.
Broadly speaking. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just curious, why would other Sri Sampradaya would have different ideas? They think there are three types of jivas, and I think Madhvacharyas also has different categorization of what jivas.
The Vallabh Sampradaya and the Madhva Sampradaya.
Well. I think one of the two. They also divide jiva into male and female. I'm not sure which Sampradaya.
Okay.
Anyway. Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, we can conclude here for today, and tomorrow we'll go, not tomorrow, but in the next reading, we'll look a little bit more about how this bondage, or how this action of Maya works on a psychological level, how this embodiment and delusion actually takes place, so to speak, some of the mechanics of it. And then we'll get into the spirit of the prayer, having looked at the dire straits that is the existential condition of the samsari. Then we'll get into, from that, the spirit of this prayer of Mahaprabhu, how he's praying and why he's praying to Bhagavan as he does, and what potential that prayer has for the jiva. So that will come in our next discussion, and hopefully with that we'll conclude this Danyokti Prakaran of the text. So we'll see. Vaishnavibhyo namo namo. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe.
Jai Shri Radhe.
Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai.